Good morning. What was it W.C. Fields said about children and animals? As we have the gentle mooing in the background and the dogs keeping us busy, my two are here for the blessing, but they are in the car because I didn't think I could do this and restrain them. So you are in good company. So I'm 11 years old, and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I've just arrived at what was the Museum of a Menagerie at the Central Park Zoo. I was walking across the park. Yes, at 11 years old, we were allowed to walk across the park alone from the Ethical Culture School to my father's office, which overlooked the sea lion pond because he was Commissioner of Parks. And you get to get an office overlooking the sea lion pond. Of course, back then it was a mucky gray-green, and the sea lions would pop their heads up and disappear. And that place was a very different place. But it inspired an 11-year-old to become a wildlife biologist. How does that happen? Well, first of all, now having a 12-year-old, I realized it was 4 o'clock. Did I say it's 4 o'clock? I'm 11 years old. And my father was desperate to get a couple more hours of work in. So he sent me to see Fritz. Fritz was the head zookeeper of the Central Park Zoo in the early 70s. And Fritz thought, Commissioner's son, let's really show this kid what it's like. So I would hose out the hippo pool. My least favorite was not hosing out the hippo pool. It was mucking out the big cats' cages. And those were back when the cages were the size of this table or a little bigger. And despite all of this, somehow animals speak to us better than people do. There was one particular animal, though, who really changed my life. Lucy. She was a chimpanzee. Some matron on Park Avenue had thought it would be nice to have a chimpanzee as a pet. And when they're 3 or 4 months old, it is fun. And they're like little babies, and they're loving, and they cling to you. Then they grow up. But unlike our children who grow up slowly, chimps grow up quickly. And at 18 months, 19 months old, she was wrecking the apartment, to be polite. And the National Zoo had a collection of chimpanzees, still does. The Bronx Zoo didn't, and Central Park Zoo was the way station for this poor chimp on her way to a much better life. Thank you. And I would, for a month, once a week, I got to take her out in a stroller. And I'd open the cage, and there was a keeper with me, but those of you who are lawyers in the room will recognize that liability was a very different thing in the early 70s. And the chimp would jump into the stroller, and I would push her around the Central Park Zoo, and then I would get to play with her in her cage for a little bit before going home and doing my homework. That actually was my homework, but my teachers didn't know that. And that chimp changed my life. Right, in a way that the dachshunds that I bred and reared their puppies didn't, and in the way that horses up in Woodstock, where we had a house, didn't. That chimp was a sentient being who couldn't speak to me, but spoke to me with her eyes, and the joy that you would see in her eyes every time she got out of that horrible cage. And she ended up in a much better place. But so that was the beginning of how, a nice Jewish boy from the Upper East Side becomes a wildlife biologist. That summer in the Tetons, weekends in Woodstock, all led to, after college, going off to Thailand, and then 15 years in Africa. And if you love animals, there is nothing better than having 15 years in East and Southern Africa, in which you are paid to watch animals and to try and figure out how to save them. And it was a good time. We were just entered, depending on how you look at it, we've been in the geological era called the Anthropocene, which geologists now say is real, because we influence the entire world, for about 3 decades. But it was a good time to be there because the population of Africa was soaring. Wildlife conservation was becoming a much more interesting and difficult task. The sixth extinction was sort of gaining steam. And I watched rhinos go extinct in both Kenya and Zimbabwe. I watched elephants decimated in Kenya, and I saw what we were doing to the other 8 million species with whom we share this earth, and for whom every major religion has given us the role of stewards. And it is a role that we never, ever should forget and cannot but take seriously. So I was in East and Southern Africa for 15 years, sort of cutting my teeth and looking at this. And it was both inspiring and depressing. It was inspiring because there is a cadre of scientists around the world who cares, but even more importantly, when you connect with local communities, many of whom have nothing. I had been a vegetarian for 12 years until I drove a friend to the Somali border for Eid al-Fitr, and his father slaughtered a goat in my honor. And when somebody takes a significant piece of their net worth and puts it on a plate in front of you, the answer is thank you. But you would talk with these people in remote villages, and they knew wildlife better than we did because they depended on it and depended on understanding how to reduce conflict with wildlife. And it wasn't a question of whether wildlife should or shouldn't be there. It was a question of how you managed coexistence. And so those years were really important to me because despite being depressing, and the narrative of conservation being one that is usually depressing, they turned me into an optimist. And I saw that there was hope, and that hope, I think, is being fulfilled. So you can't talk about the environment without mentioning two words these days, climate and change. And even with climate change, there is a fact that most people have ignored because it's moderately irrelevant but terribly symbolic, which is for the last 3 years we have stabilized our carbon emissions. Right? Anybody told you that before? It should be on the front page of the New York Times every day. Right? And what that shows is, although our carbon emissions are way too high, that we have stopped as a global community increasing them. Right? And the first step towards decrease is to stop increasing. There are other optimistic or reasons to be optimistic. I'm working on a study right now with a colleague up in Canada because she and I got very tired of the following narrative. In the old days, pre-1750, carnivores were everywhere, they were diverse, there were big populations, and it was wonderful. Now they only occupy 20, 30, 40% of their original range, they're in decline, and there's nothing we can do about it. And as with many things in life, it's not the data or the answer, it's the question you ask that really matters. And so my friend Justina and I said, well, that may be true, but number one, what do we know about the original distributions, and are they what they were? We've done a lot of research and discovered that they're overestimated by about 20%. So now we're talking about 80% of what we thought it was and 40% of what we thought. So these numbers are converging. But even more importantly, in the early 20th century through the late 20th century, carnivores took it on the head. They were killed on bounty. They were hunted when the populations were small, and they really retreated to the mountains and to very small populations because that's where they could survive. And if you look at what we are calling technically the nadir, or the bottom of the distribution, what you discover is we have recovered carnivores across this country. Mountain lions, black bears, grizzly bears, wolves, coyotes have spread far and wide, foxes, river otters, I could keep going, there are 13 species we're looking at. But fundamentally, every one of those species is following the same trajectory of high to very low to recovery. And you can ask the question, as I think you should ask all questions about conservation, not are things worse than they used to be in the good old days, but are they better than they used to be in the bad old days? And I think fundamentally we are at a point where things can and are mostly getting better. Every day I go into work with 100 of the most optimistic people in Millbrook. And those people are working together to study things that from the bottom up support life on Earth. And what could be more important than fresh water? And the ecology of the fresh water, whether in the streams and rivers or in the water we drink. Well, maybe the forests and the air we breathe, right? The forests we live in and the forests that clean the air, right? And we spend a lot of time studying that. We have a funny focus on what I think is the future salvation of humanity, which are cities. 50% of the world lives in cities. It's going to be 75% of the world, and it will be a larger world, so absolutely many more people will live in cities. And making those cities livable, sustainable, and ecologically friendly is the best way to get people off the rural landscape and the wildlands of the world and give the other 8 million species some space. Finally, the thing that we share with animals that we prefer not to, both they and we, are diseases. And so at the Carey Institute, we spend a lot of time trying to understand the ecology of the diseases that affect us and affect animals around us, whether it's Zika or Ebola or, more locally, Lyme disease. And so I have this tremendous optimism. And I share that optimism with other people, but I think on today, the most important person with whom I share it is Pope Francis. I think when Francis took the name Francis, it was the first indication of his commitment to global stewardship of the earth as a whole, that he then issued his first encyclical, Laudato Si', on care of our common home, and those of you who are Latin scholars, you will forgive me. And that directly addresses the greatest environmental threat of our time, climate change, but even more, it addresses stewardship of the earth and of the animals and plants with whom we share this earth. And some in both the scientific and the faith communities have criticized Pope Francis for what is a religious figure doing getting in the middle of politics. Well, number one, he has a master's in chemistry and knows something about the subject. But even more importantly, he's not getting involved in politics. He's getting involved in faith, and the faith requires that we take care of the earth. And so his statement very early on in his tenure about the importance of the earth, yes, I know, I should finish, I hear you, is important to me. And I think, when it first came out, the media missed it, as they often do, and said, head of the Catholic Church, 1 billion Catholics, this is great. But Catholics, Jews, Protestants, Muslims, right, Hindus, Buddhists, right, all took notice that one of the world's authoritative religious figures had said, we've gone too far, and we have to pull back, and we cannot be so selfish. Humanity deserves its place, but we have to share. And mentioning Buddhists, one of my favorite poets is a Buddhist, Gary Snyder. He's a naturalist, he's a man with a deep sense of humor, and I just want to end today with a poem that I use in these circumstances regularly because it is short and it is to the point. It's called Earth Verse. Wide enough to keep you looking, open enough to keep you moving, dry enough to keep you honest, prickly enough to make you tough, green enough to go on living, old enough to give you dreams. Thank you.